I'm Eric Fruits. I publish the Econ Minute podcast and blog. Econ Minute is the media arm of Economics International Corp. In my day job, I'm an economic consultant where I provide research for business, governments, and think tanks. I also provide expert testimony in lawsuits and in regulatory matters. If you need research, advice, expert testimony, or a speaker for your next event, contact me at 503-928-6635. That's 503-928-6635. Or email me at info@econminute.com. Econ Minute is all one word, and it's info@econminute.com. You are watching a presentation that I gave in the summer of 2015 to the Oregon Fuels Association regarding the state's recently adopted low carbon fuel standard. The regulations have many more unknowns than knowns, and it's not even clear that the fuel standard will do one single thing to slow, halt, or reverse climate change. I hope you enjoy the presentation. Please feel free to contact me with any follow-up. Again, that's info@econminute.com, or visit the blog at econminute.com. So, without further ado, here goes. A lot of these things you already know. We already know that the low carbon fuel standard is a really bad idea. It's not going to be good for Oregon. It's not going to be good for Oregonians. So what I'm hoping to do is through this discussion today, give you some ways that you can talk about the low carbon fuel standard to the people in the street when it goes to the ballot, to legislators as we go into the February session and hope to change some things. So what we're going to talk about, first of all, is can Oregon make a difference? Can Oregon save the world? If you've ever seen the show Heroes, which came out a few years ago, there's one of the first storylines that's called Save the Cheerleader, Save the World. It's kind of like save Oregon, save the world. Can we do it? The next part is can Oregonians afford the low carbon fuel standard? Third thing we'll talk about is what are the risks and uncertainties associated with this standard? And last we'll talk about some winners and losers. So the first question is, can Oregon make a difference? You've probably seen these bumper stickers all over on people's cars. I decided I'd use it myself to talk about oil. So the question is, can Oregon make a difference? We like to think that we're a special snowflake, we're special, we're different, right? But you also have to remember the entire population of the state of Oregon is slightly bigger than the Seattle metropolitan area. It's a little bit bigger than the San Diego metropolitan area. We're a really tiny state, and so we really can't make that big a difference. Let's take a look. The world CO2 emissions, and that's just carbon dioxide emissions, that's 32.3 billion metric tons. It's a little bit more than 4,700 metric tons per person. So that's a big number, 32.3 billion metric tons worldwide, and that's just CO2. Let's look at Oregon's share, and since this is the OFA, we're looking at the total carbon CO2 emissions associated with petroleum used in transportation. That's 0.06% of the total. That's not 6%, that's 0.06% of total worldwide emissions. That's 6/100ths of 1%. If you like to think of it another way, that is 1/1600th of the total emissions in the world. On this map of the world, you'll see that there's a grid. There's 1,600 squares on that grid. We are one of those little squares. Happens to be right pretty much where Oregon is. If you're like me, you had to drive a couple hours to get to the Sunriver, and as you're driving along, for me it's US 26, you hit some bugs, and they hit your windshield. Oregon is one of those gnats on your windshield. If you wipe away the bug, you're not going to drive any better, and with the bug there, you're not going to drive any worse. We are a fly speck. Oregon can disappear off the face of the earth, and you won't see anything happen to carbon emissions in the world. And what's great about this, I think this is a brilliant argument, and it's nothing really unique. You don't have to fight about climate change. You don't have to say, oh, he's a climate denier. It's like, no. I could totally believe in climate change. I could totally believe that humans cause climate change. I could totally believe that CO2 is what's causing, or carbon emissions are what's causing climate change. This is just pure mathematics. We don't matter. We could double our output, we could cut it in half, we could disappear from the face of the earth. No one will know. Can Oregon afford the low carbon fuel standard? And this is something that I think is important that really doesn't get talked about much. Oregon is actually in pretty bad shape. We are the frog in the pot. The heat keeps getting turned up and we're starting to boil, but we don't know it because we live in such a wonderful place and we're all such special snowflakes. Personal income per person, and this is going back to 1929, but I started in 1930, so my graph looks okay. World War II was awesome for Oregon. We were building ships, we had a lot of industrial activity. After World War II, Oregon's per capita, that means per person, Oregon's per person income was 10% above the national average. Today, it's 10% below the national average. We never really recovered from the recession of the 1980s. And then we started having the spotted owl. And when we had the problems with personal incomes then, one of my old bosses invented this thing called the second paycheck. And he said, yeah, sure, we're all getting poorer and things aren't looking so good, but we get a second paycheck by having clean air and beautiful mountains and looking at deer as we drive into our conferences. And, gosh darn it, it's okay that we don't make much money because we're getting a second paycheck from other stuff. We get a tech boom, but even the tech boom didn't bring us up above the US average. And that's one of the things I think is really amazing is that the tech boom was big for Oregon. It really helped us out, but it never got us above the national average. And then we have the recession that happened after the dot-com bubble popped. We've never really recovered from that, and now we are on this steady downward decline. That's not showing up right because I used a funky font that doesn't show up on PCs. Cost of living. Now here's something that's really amazing, and I know I've talked to some people who've been lobbying the legislature. This is becoming a story that's starting to circulate through Oregon, is that our cost of living is really starting to skyrocket. This here looks like it's a fairly stable relationship. It's because there's just not very good data going back in time. This is from the Bureau of Labor Statistics back in 1980. Our cost of living was a little bit below the national average. So it may as well say it was roughly equal to the national average, or the US cost of living. Throughout 1990, the recession dropped our cost of living, so we were slightly better off. So, and in this case, the negative number is good because we have a lower cost of living. But then things started happening. We started seeing our cost of living skyrocket. A big part of that is driven by housing prices. Our housing prices are really starting to rise, and a lot of that is due to our land use rules. But another part of it, too, is also our fuel costs. Energy is getting more expensive in Oregon, and so that's driving up our cost of living. So now today, our cost of living is about 29% higher than the US average. That's pretty steep. It's almost too steep. I don't know if I quite believe it, but give me better data and I'll use it. Put those two together. We got the lower incomes, we got the higher cost of living, and we can have what we call kind of an adjusted personal income. The adjusted personal income combines those two factors. So today, if you account for the cost of living and the lower incomes, we're about 16% worse off than the rest of the country, than the US as a whole. That's pretty big. We're 16% poorer than the average American. So that tells you, can we afford a new tax? Can we afford higher costs of fuel? That's going to lower our standard of living even more. So now we're going to move on to the low carbon fuel standard and talk about how in the heck does it actually work. Now, in some of the other presentations I've heard, we've talked about the low carbon fuel standard, cap and trade, and a carbon tax, as if they're three separate things. But if we think about the low carbon fuel standard, really looks and acts like some sort of, like a version of cap and trade. What do? We set a target. If you exceed that target, you have to pay, you get to buy credits. If you go below that target, you get to receive credits. And if you look at it on its face, you say, well, gee, that makes sense, right? It's kind of a market-based solution. Economists love markets. And back when I started graduate school, this whole idea of cap and trade and carbon trade was kind of a big deal. Economists really liked it because on paper, it looks awesome. It does everything that an economist would want to have happen. You have markets, buyers and sellers working together, determining a price. The problem is a lot of economists have now discovered that the nitty-gritty of how these programs actually work, the technical aspects, make cap and trade policies really difficult to implement. And one way of thinking about kind of how silly the low carbon fuel standard is to get away from fuel and carbon for just a second and recognize that America has an obesity epidemic, right? We've got, it's kind of
to me it's strange. We have both an epidemic of hunger and an epidemic of obesity. I call them the heavy hungry. But if you think about it, we have this obesity epidemic. And again, you don't have to believe that there is one, but just assume there is, and assume that it's caused by fast food. And so maybe what we should have in Oregon is a low-fat sandwich standard. And under the low-fat sandwich standard, what we do is we'll say we'll have a target. No sandwich can have more than 15 grams of fat. If you go over, you have to buy fat credits. And if you go under, you get to receive fat credits. And so I looked it up. McDonald's Big Mac, 33 grams of fat. Man, it's good. It got cut off here, but if you bought under this low-fat sandwich standard, you'd have to buy 90 cents in credits to get a Big Mac. This here is a 6-inch Veggie Delight from Subway. Has only 2.5 grams of fat. Now, how do you get a sandwich with 2.5 grams of fat? No cheese, no mayonnaise. If you add cheese and mayonnaise, it gets up to 16. It would exceed the low-fat sandwich standard. But this tasteless Subway sandwich would then get 62.5 cents worth of fat credits. And so you're going to say, Fruits, this is a really stupid graph. This is a stupid idea. Well, it's stupid for sandwiches, but it seems to be brilliant for carbon. So what gives? Let's take a look at how it would work under the low carbon fuel standard. One of the challenges I had in trying to put together this presentation is to try to do an illustration like this, because I know a lot of us think in terms of gallons, consumers think in terms of gallons, but everything that is developed under the standard is done in terms of energy content. And so the 2020 standard, for example, the 2020 standard says that that if you had that you would have only 84.91, so 85 grams of CO2. CO2 is carbon dioxide. E means equivalent, so 85 grams of carbon dioxide equivalents per megajoule. Okay, what does that mean? Well, there's a 5-step process that you take to figure out how many credits you would get or owe. The first step is figuring out what's the energy content of the fuel you're selling. It turns out that diesel made from food waste has a lower energy content than regular old diesel. That's why the target's a little bit lower. And then you figure out what's the carbon intensity associated with each type. And the carbon intensity on diesel for food waste is a lot lower. They also include things like the land use component. So it's not just the carbon involved in the fuel itself. So you plug all that into the 5-step process, and you find that if you're selling diesel, 1 million gallons of diesel, your target would be 11,400 metric tons of CO2. But the actual amount of carbon that's contained that you sell is 12,700 metric tons, which means that you're making 1,300 metric tons too much carbon. You would have to buy those credits. But if you're making diesel from food waste, your target's a little bit lower because you have lower energy content. But the amount you're selling has only 2,000 metric tons of CO2. So it means a really low amount of carbon associated with the diesel from food waste. So that person would receive credits of 8,700 metric tons of CO2. So if we were to trade these credits, let's assume that it's $30 per metric ton of CO2, which is a little bit higher than what it's trading at right now in California, but 30 is a nice round number. The diesel guy would have to buy 1,300 credits at $30 a piece. The cost of the credits would be $39,000, which gives you a 3.9 cent per gallon tax. 3.9 cents per gallon sounds very familiar. It's kind of close to what DEQ says the increase in fuel price will be. That's just pure coincidence, though. If we look, it truly is a coincidence. If you look at the diesel from food waste, though, they get 8,700 credits. The value is $30. The value is $261,000. So their subsidy is 26.1 cents. And notice I used the nasty word tax and subsidy because at this point, that's really what it is. You are paying a tax of 3.9 cents per gallon in order to subsidize someone at the amount of 26.1 cents per gallon. So the next question then is, are there any risks? So if you think about it, there's a lot of things that can affect the value of the credits and how much we produce. In fact, I'm going to have to admit something here. I'm embarrassed to admit it. I have absolutely no idea what I'm doing at this point. And I know I should never say that as someone who's speaking in front of a conference when I'm supposed to be the expert and know what I'm talking about. But the reason why I have no idea what I'm talking about is because no one has any idea what they're talking about. This is from a document from December 2014 that DEQ put out, so right before the legislative session started. And it's a draft document, but I haven't seen the final version of it. And when they talk about this program, they say, the flexibility in this regulatory approach, flexibility is usually a good thing, but substitute the word uncertainty and you get the same idea. The flexibility in this regulatory approach makes it difficult to estimate the fiscal and economic cost to individual regulated parties or fuel consumers with any specificity. Wow. In other words, they have no idea what they're talking about. Look at this, the cost to comply. Get ready to count with me. The cost to comply with the standards will depend on each regulated party's unique compliance strategy. That means every single person in this room has a different way of dealing with these standards. So they have no idea how you guys are going to react. Each party's unique compliance strategy and the future availability and cost of clean fuels and clean fuel credits, and those factors in turn will be influenced by future market forces, which could be whatever. Think about all those different levers that have to get pulled, and nobody knows anything about how these credits will work in this market. Now we can look to California and see how these work. So what will be the market price of a credit? This is from the California Low Carbon Fuel Standards market. It's a pretty thin market. There's no good data, monthly data, until about 2013, the end of 2013, I think it's October. And we see that the first year, the average price was $17 per credit, per metric ton. Then it went up in 2013 to about $58 per credit, skyrocketed up to 80, it was just a shade under 80, I believe. And now it's dropped down to about $28 per credit. So can you imagine working in a market where the price of one of your assets can fluctuate by a factor of 4 in the space of just a few years? Now, I was talking to Mark Fitz earlier, and he said, "Oh, we love volatility." But I don't think you love this kind of volatility, because this is a volatility in a value of your asset or your cost structure, and that's something that you have to plan for. You might be able to pass that on to your consumers, but you may not. Another big factor is, and we'll get to this in a second, is what will be the volume of trade. Right now, if you look in California, the volume of trade is relatively small. You're looking at, I forget what the exact number is on the average, it's something like a little less than 100,000 metric tons per trade. And you see, though, that as the volume in metric tons increases, the price decreases. In other words, as you have more people engaging in activity, you will see lower prices. That's a good thing. If you have an active market, you'll see lower prices. Another way to look at it is how many transactions. So not just what's the total metric tons involved, but how many people are actually engaging in trades. Last year, the last full year, and actually the biggest full year that we had of trades in these low carbon fuel standard credits, averaged a little bit less than 30 trades per month. That's pretty small. A lot of the transactions happen to be internal transactions. So you could be someone who maybe makes diesel and biodiesel from food waste. You owe credits from one fuel, you receive credits from the other, you put them together, and maybe they net out. And so you have a lot of internal trading where these things never occur in the marketplace, where you can never get a price that comes out of it. There's been some reports of some trades where some transfer of credits where it's not actually a trade, where maybe the transfer of credits is part of some other deal, and so you don't actually get a price attached to the credits. But again, we can see that as we have more transactions, we have a lower price. right thing here. So more transactions, lower price. Now one of the big concerns I have with the Oregon market is that it will be a very thin market. So we're talking about an average of about, right now, 30 trades per month. Oregon's market is what, a tenth the size of California's? How many trades will we have? How thin will that market be? And what will the pricing be under that thin trading scheme? Now there might be a new market that develops where you might have interstate trades, although I haven't seen any reports of interstate trading happening. That doesn't mean it won't happen in the future. The other thing right now is there's no clear description of how the market will look. The way that the credits are supposed to be traded are through brokers. There's no plan right now for a centralized exchange where credits would be traded, but you work with a broker, and the broker then tries to coordinate buyers and sellers. And that leads me to this guy. That's Gordon Gekko from Wall Street, the movie Wall Street. And this is probably one of my bigger concerns about the low carbon fuel standard, and that is market manipulation. And I've done some work for the Securities and Exchange Commission on market manipulation of relatively big markets, the trading of stocks. And we have found that if you have some thinly traded stocks, in other words, stocks where there's not a lot of transactions, you can actually fairly easily manipulate the market. And you may think, well, gee, a lot of times when you hear about market manipulation, you think about the pump and dump schemes, right? Someone puts out a newsletter and says, oh, go buy stock A, B, and C, and the stock price goes up, and then all of a sudden the people who are promoting it dump the stock, and the price drops, and all the people who came in at the high price are left holding the bag. Well, that happens quite a bit. But another way that price manipulation works for the person who's manipulating the price is to set a reference price. In one of the cases I worked on involving stock price manipulation, it was involving a penny stock. And what would happen is, on Friday afternoon, the guy who's manipulating the stock would call 2 or 3 of his friends and he'd say, hey, I need the price to get up to $1 by close. And these guys would buy like 100 or 200 shares, nothing. They'd buy 100 or 200 shares of the stock, price would come up to $100. And then what would happen is over the weekend, this guy, the president of the company, would go meet with private investors. And he'd tell the private investors, look, I want to do a private placement with you. I'll go sell you some shares. I'm going to sell you these shares for 50 cents a share. But look, today the price is $1. You're already doubling your money. And so it wasn't the transaction on the market that was important. It was using that market price as a reference price. And you can imagine how that manipulation could work if maybe you're working on a contract where you might base some of that agreement on the value of the credits. And so market manipulation is a big concern of mine. If you read the documents that are out there already on market manipulation, the state of Oregon, DEQ, has this approach that just says, trust us. They say, we will have factors in place that will limit or reduce any opportunity for market manipulation. I don't know how. I don't know how that's going to happen. As I said, I've worked on cases where you see market manipulation in stock prices, where those trades are regulated by not just the SEC, but also by the exchanges themselves. I've seen market manipulation in commodities. I did a case involving market manipulation in the dairy markets. And that was fascinating because what happened was most of your milk prices are determined by about 5 or 6 people who meet in a room once a month to decide the price of cheese. Cheese is the reference price that's used to set milk prices. And so all that cascades. And so if you manipulate the cheese price by buying just a few extra 1,000 pounds of cheese, you can manipulate the milk price. And so that's my concern with these credits. And as I said, Oregon is a small state. And yes, we like to think we're special. We like to think we're smart, but we just don't have a deep bench of talent. And we don't have the sort of people with regulatory savvy to know when market manipulation is happening. If you look at all of the big projects that the state of Oregon has undertaken, all of them, I can't think of one that hasn't been a failure. I mean, the most obvious one is Cover Oregon, right? $350 million wasted on the exchange. But guess what? That's dwarfed by OWIN, the Oregon Wireless Interoperability Network. I call it the inoperable network, because it didn't work, and that was after spending $600 million. The Oregon Health Plan is really a failure. It's nothing more than Medicaid now. All of these major programs were because we don't have a deep bench of talent, and we can't really run major exchanges, major businesses as a regulated entity. So are there any winners? And I know some of you are already thinking, I can feel the brainwaves coming from you of who you know the winners are. I can feel them coming from you. And I'm not trying to pick on anyone, but I just pulled this out of the Portland Business Journal. Sequential Pacific Biofuels is on track to produce 7.25 million gallons of biofuels from used cooking oil in 2015. So using that same sort of calculation that I did earlier to talk about how the credits are traded, Sequential Pacific Biofuels would get a credit subsidy of about $1.9 million on the biofuels they sell. Now that's assuming that they sell all of those biofuels in Oregon, which we know isn't true, but they are going to sell those fuels in the places where they get the credits, because if they have a choice between getting credits or not getting credits, they will choose to get credits. So we can think of this as an upper end. They can get as much as $1.9 million. Is the Earth a winner? Remember, we said that the Earth doesn't even know that Oregon exists. And remember, what we're doing is we're taking our 0.06 of carbon emissions, world carbon emissions, and we're going to reduce them by 10%. So we are going to reduce total worldwide carbon emissions by 1/17,000th. So I don't think the world's going to be any better off or even notice that Oregon has enacted a low carbon fuel standard. So the Earth isn't necessarily a winner. That's why I put the question marks there. Are there any losers? Well, the biggest losers are going to be consumers, because fuel prices will increase. And what we have here are 4 estimates of what the price impact on fuel will be for consumers. We have a 5th one, which is something I just completely made up. Actually, I didn't make up. I developed it. What I did is I said, let's pretend we didn't have a low carbon fuel standard. Let's pretend that we wanted to reduce carbon emissions by 10%. And the way that we're going to do that is simply by raising fuel prices. And I looked at a bunch of economic studies on what is the relationship between fuel prices and fuel consumption. And it's roughly, it's called elasticity. The elasticity is 0.2, which means that if you increase fuel prices by 10%, consumption will decrease by 2%. Which means that if we want to reduce our total fuel consumption by about 10%, we'd have to see $1.50 per gallon increase, which is about a 50% increase in fuel prices. Now, what's funny about this is when Kathy was giving her presentation, she talked about how would consumers respond in vehicle miles traveled to an increase in fuel. Turns out the relationship is almost exactly the same, which tells me that I think I'm right, because there's 2 different ways of looking at the same question. If we had to raise fuel prices by $1.50 per gallon, we're looking at that being $5.10 per person. That means every man, woman, and child in the state of Oregon. That's a lot of money. If we look at the lower end, the 2 lower estimates here, well, let me back up. There's 4 estimates that are out there. There's 2 that have been put out by WISPA, and they've both been done by ICF. What?
Boston Consulting.
By Boston Consulting Group. Sorry, it's by Boston Consulting Group. One at 33 cents per gallon, one at $1.06 per gallon. The 33 cents per gallon would amount to $125 per person increase in fuel prices or fuel costs per year. Again, that's per person, man, woman, and child. So in my household of 6, that would be $700. If you raise it to $1.06 per gallon, it would be $375 per person, man, woman, and child. Those are big numbers, which is why I suspect that DEQ says, oh, those WISPA Boston Consulting Group numbers, they aren't good. The numbers we think are good are these lower numbers of 4 cents a gallon and 19 cents a gallon. They don't explain why they're good or better, other than they say, we like the assumptions better. And they seem to suggest that it better reflects the flexibility in the market, which means uncertainty. So we see then that we have a pretty steep increase. Now, we had a huge fight in Portland over a street fee that would amount to about $70 per person. It was such a big fight that it actually failed. So we can see that $70 per person could actually be pretty steep and may be something that people aren't too keen on seeing, and may help us as we go forward into the referendum or the ballot initiative. I would probably recalculate that as a per household number, and then because that number will be higher, and we'll see then that there could be a pretty big impact. I would also like to get a better idea of what the actual number is for Oregon, because if I recall correctly, none of these studies actually look at Oregon specifically. What they do is they take studies that have been done for other states, mostly California, and said, oh, and they've extrapolated and said, here's what would happen in Oregon. Oregon may behave a lot differently. Remember, we don't have any refineries in Oregon. So the bottom line is that any benefits, and remember, those benefits are small. They're really small. We're looking at a 1 in 17,000 reduction in carbon emissions in the world, which is nothing. But even then, those benefits, however small they are going to be spread worldwide. But all the costs are going to be borne in Oregon by Oregonians. Back in the Middle Ages, there were a group of people during the plague that would walk through towns, and they beat each other with whips. And their idea was that as they beat themselves with the whips, it would drive the plague out of their bodies. And but they also were walking through the town doing this to show off, that they were doing this, that they were beating themselves and punishing themselves to drive the plague out. Well, it's kind of like Paul on his clapping for elephants or snapping for elephants. It never really did anything to stop the plague. But it really showed that these people were willing to make a sacrifice to save the world, even though it didn't do anything. That's kind of what's happening here with the low carbon fuel standard. Oregonians are going to beat themselves with higher fuel prices in a world where we have declining incomes, higher cost of living, just to show off to the world that we're willing to beat ourselves to have no impact that won't actually cure the disease. When I was putting together my presentation, my wife said, "How come there's a burrito on your PowerPoint?" I said, "Well, it's because it's my wrap up." And I don't know how many grams of fat are in that one. So the big takeaways here are that Oregon cannot make a difference in world carbon emissions as much as we want to, as much as we think we can. Now, they might say that we can be the standard bearers. We could show the world what we can do. But remember, it's a lot like the flagellants, the people who beat themselves. You're punishing yourself just to show off. Oregon cannot afford a higher cost of living. We have declining incomes. It is getting harder and harder for people to, A, find work, and also make a living while they are working. I was looking at per capita personal income. If you look at also wage and salary income, you'll see that it's the same story. We are below the national average. So even people who are working at jobs are worse off. Our wages are lower than the national average. Numbers came out after I finished the presentation, but before I gave it, that Oregon's workforce participation now is at a near all-time low. We have 40% of our people who are working age out of the workforce. That is a phenomenal number, and it's worse than the U.S. average. The U.S. average is also fairly low. But we have a lot of Oregonians who, A, are unemployed, they can't find work, but also have given up looking for work. And can they afford to have higher gas prices or fuel prices in the face of low incomes and a already high cost of living? The low carbon fuel credits are a risky asset, and although sometimes we like volatility, I think this is not the volatility that you will like. And one of the challenges that we have with the low carbon fuel credits is that they can be banked. They have, as far as I know, an endless life. And in fact, DEQ has said that the only way that the system will work is if we generate a lot of credits up front and then sit on them and draw those credits down as time goes by. So what you're going to have are a bunch of people sitting on their low carbon fuel standard credits, and you don't know when they're going to release them. And so that introduces a lot of uncertainty about when those credits will or can be used. And so those are a risky asset that will then feed into your own uncertainty. The winners are going to be a small set of favored businesses. And I wasn't trying to pick on sequential biofuels because I know there's others out there who will benefit, but there's only a few of those beneficiaries. And once those beneficiaries are in place, you can guarantee that they will have an office in Salem somewhere, and they will be visiting the legislature. It's the same sort of thing with the low carbon fuel standard credits. As you're sitting on credits, you now have a valuable asset. You won't see anyone working to get rid of those fuel credits if they're sitting on them. And again, those people will have an office in Salem making sure that the standard doesn't go away. The losers are spread out through Oregon, which makes this, from a political standpoint, a perfect program because the winners are concentrated and they can concentrate their winnings to help perpetuate their winnings. The losers are spread out throughout the state, and they may only be worse off by $15 a person, but they could be worse off by $375 a person. If they're worse off by $375, you'll hear from them. If they're worse off by $15, you probably won't. So the losers are spread out through Oregon, and that's, again, one of the big issues with the low carbon fuel standard. Will it make a big impact? Will it actually do something to reduce carbon and reduce fuel consumption? If it has a big impact positively in that way, it will also have a big impact negatively in the increase in fuel prices. If it has a small impact where it doesn't make that much of a noticeable difference in emissions or carbon output, then why are we going through this huge process? I know I've heard some of you already complaining about the paperwork requirements, and DEQ is now working on estimates of how much extra FTEs, full-time equivalents, you will need to actually just to comply with this. And we're looking at, on average, of maybe half an FTE, in other words, half of a full-time employee for a whole year working on this, to almost one full FTE. That's a person who isn't bringing in any extra money to your business, but you have to pay for to manage this program. And so I think that one of the key takeaways with this is that we really need to get rid of it before it goes into motion.